70,000 parts per million. That is the reading a team of scientists just pulled out of a sealed railway tunnel on the edge of Naples. If that number means nothing to you yet, it will by the end of this video. It sits close to double the level at which carbon dioxide becomes an immediate threat to human life. It is rising straight out of the ground from a supervolcano that 6 million people currently live on top of. And the earth beneath that city has not trembled, lifted, and pushed gas upward like this since the last time this same volcano built a brand new mountain out of flat land in a matter of days. If you have never heard the name PPMThe before today, that changes right now. Subscribe before you go any further, because what is unfolding in Naples right now is exactly the kind of story that will not stay quiet for long, and you'll want to already be watching this channel when it moves into its next chapter. A railway tunnel on the western edge of Naples was sealed off more than a month ago. For weeks, the people living nearby were told only that carbon dioxide levels inside were elevated, that the readings were abnormal, that the situation was being monitored. Elevated, abnormal. Those were the words used publicly. Then the actual instrument data was released. Between late June and the first days of July, a monitoring station positioned roughly 50 meters inside the sealed tunnel recorded carbon dioxide, making up close to 7% of the air by volume. Converted into the units safety agencies use for gas exposure, that works out to 70,000 parts per million. Normal outdoor air runs somewhere around 420 to 430 parts per million. In other words, the air trapped inside that tunnel carried more than 150 times the carbon dioxide of the air being breathed by residents walking past its locked entrance every single day. The tunnel connects the Pisciarelli Solfatara station and the Naples Campi Flegrei station, running along line 2 of the city's transit network. Even its name feels almost deliberately chosen now. It's known as the Flegrea Tunnel, after the Phlegrean Fields, a name that traces back to ancient Latin, roughly translating to burning fields, which is exactly what the Romans called this landscape. The tunnel has been closed since mid-June, and the gap between what residents were told and what the instruments were actually recording isn't a small difference in wording. It's the difference between describing a minor inconvenience and describing an atmosphere capable of killing someone. To understand what 70,000 parts per million actually means for a human body, you need to know where the official danger thresholds sit. The agency responsible for setting workplace safety limits in the United States defines the concentration at which carbon dioxide becomes immediately dangerous to life, or health, at 40,000 parts per million. Cross that line, and exposure can cause a person to lose consciousness fast enough that they can't get themselves out in time. The peak reading recorded inside this tunnel was 70,000 parts per million, roughly 75% above that emergency threshold. At that concentration, someone walking in without protective gear would start experiencing serious symptoms within minutes: dizziness, confusion, a loss of coordination, and then, often without any more dramatic warning, unconsciousness. Early estimates from researchers put the volume of carbon dioxide flowing into the tunnel at roughly 95 tons a day, which works out to about half a cubic meter of pure gas entering that enclosed space every single second. This isn't a faint trace drifting in from some distant vent. It's a sustained, powerful, continuous stream of volcanic gas moving through infrastructure that, until recently, was carrying thousands of commuters daily. And the monitoring report attached to these figures made one point explicitly clear. Given the current activity beneath the caldera, further increases in that gas flow cannot be ruled out. Carbon dioxide isn't dangerous in the way most people instinctively picture a toxic gas. Being dangerous, it has no smell. It produces no visible haze. It doesn't trigger the immediate burning or choking sensation that would normally warn someone away. What it actually does is push oxygen out of the way and raise the acidity of a person's blood. The body responds to rising carbon dioxide by breathing faster, which, in an enclosed, gas-filled space, only drags more of that harmful concentration deeper into the lungs. At moderate levels, the symptoms are a headache, a racing pulse, a sense of disorientation. But by the time concentrations reach what was measured in this tunnel, the gap between feeling slightly off and losing consciousness shrinks down to a matter of minutes, and the warning signs aren't dramatic enough to reliably trigger someone's instinct to turn around and get out before it's too late. 3 physical traits of carbon dioxide combine to make this especially dangerous inside a tunnel like this one. It has no color, it has no smell, and it is heavier than air. That last property matters most in a long, enclosed underground space. Carbon dioxide doesn't spread evenly through a tunnel, and it doesn't rise and disperse the way lighter gases do. It sinks. It flows toward the lowest points. It pools. It accumulates. And it builds to its worst levels overnight, when whatever small amount of air movement exists during the day settles into complete stillness. A worker or inspector walking into that tunnel would get no sensory warning at all. No smell, nothing visible, no immediate physical cue. The first sign that anything was wrong would be dizziness, followed by confusion, followed by a loss of coordination severe enough to prevent them from turning around and walking back out before losing consciousness entirely. That is exactly why sealing the tunnel wasn't an overcautious bureaucratic move. It was the only reasonable response to an invisible, odorless, heavier-than-air volcanic gas that had quietly turned a piece of public transit infrastructure into a place where someone could die simply by walking in at the wrong moment. The danger never came from anything happening inside the tunnel itself. It came from directly underneath it, and that distinction matters for everything that follows. The gap between the soft language used in official updates and the hard numbers sitting in the monitoring data did not go unnoticed by the people living in Pozzuoli and the surrounding neighborhoods. For weeks, officials described the situation as elevated, abnormal, under observation. When the actual instrument readings became public in early July, the reaction was immediate, and it was angry. Residents understood, correctly, that elevated and 70,000 parts per million are not describing the same level of danger. One is a soft, vague word. The other is a specific number sitting close to double the threshold for an immediately life-threatening exposure. The anger wasn't really about the number itself. It was about the sense that something genuinely serious had been wrapped in language designed to calm people down rather than inform them. It's worth being precise about what the evidence actually supports here, because a gap between vague wording and alarming numbers doesn't automatically prove someone was covering something up. The gas readings are real. They came from instruments, and they were eventually made public. There is no confirmed evidence that anyone falsified data or deliberately hid a warning about an imminent eruption. What clearly did happen was a serious breakdown in communication. The physical reality and the language describing it drifted so far apart that trust between residents and the institutions responsible for their safety collapsed across that gap. When the words "people are given" sit that far away from the numbers behind them, trust doesn't survive, and honestly, it shouldn't. The tunnel isn't the only place this gas is showing up either. Volcanic carbon dioxide has been detected seeping into the basements of buildings near the Solfatara crater. It has turned up in school buildings within the affected zone. Sulfur deposits have been spotted working their way through the walls of homes close to the main crater area. The same properties that made the tunnel dangerous, colorless, odorless, heavier than air apply just as much to any enclosed low lying space sitting above the wrong patch of ground. A basement, a storage room, the bottom of a stairwell. The tunnel got a monitoring station and an official closure order because it's public infrastructure with a clear managing authority. Private homes are a much harder problem, and one that the relevant agencies are only just beginning to treat with real urgency. Italy's National Geophysics and Volcanology Institute issued a formal clarification around the same time the tunnel data became public, and the way that statement was framed added more heat to the situation rather than cooling it down. The Institute drew a careful line around exactly what its own job is. Its role, it explained, is to monitor geophysical and geochemical activity and pass scientific assessments along to the appropriate civil protection authorities. It doesn't operate the railway. It doesn't decide when the line closes or reopens. It doesn't set the schedule for trains. The Institute also made a point that was scientifically accurate, but landed poorly with the public. The roughly 30-day timeline being floated for potentially reopening the tunnel, it noted, has nothing to do with how serious the underlying gas anomaly actually is. Concentrations inside the tunnel are dictated by what the volcano is doing, not by what a repair or mitigation schedule says. A tunnel doesn't become safe because a calendar hits a certain date. It becomes safe when the gas rising into it from below drops to a safe level, and that decision belongs entirely to the volcano, not to any engineer. That statement is technically correct. It's also easy to see why residents living on top of the caldera heard it as two institutions carefully pointing at each other, while the people with the most at stake waited to find out who was actually responsible for keeping them safe. Researchers also brought a high-speed laser instrument out to the Picciarelli fumarole field, one of the caldera's most active venting areas, sitting close to the same stretch of ground the sealed tunnel runs beneath. The instrument measures hydrogen sulfide, the gas responsible for that unmistakable rotten egg smell around volcanic vents, and it reacts to changing concentrations in roughly 1 second, which makes it sensitive to short, sharp spikes that slower. Conventional monitoring equipment tends to smooth over. What the laser picked up was hard to ignore. Around 10 meters from the main vent, hydrogen sulfide spiked to 60 parts per million within a single hour, averaging somewhere around 11 to 12 parts per million across that stretch. The fixed monitoring stations permanently watching that same field had only ever logged maximum readings of around 3.6 parts per million over a comparable period. The fast laser was catching bursts more than 16 times higher than what the official instruments were showing. That doesn't mean the permanent equipment is broken or that its numbers were manipulated. It simply means Those instruments were positioned differently and sampled only a portion of each hour, averaging away the brief, intense spikes that a person standing near the vent in that exact moment would actually be breathing. When the same laser was moved out to a distance of 120 meters from the vent, readings dropped below detection entirely. The danger here is sharp, highly localized, and worst precisely where people are most likely to be standing. Up close, in the moment, what a person actually breathes in can be considerably worse than what the averaged official numbers suggest. None of this is happening in isolation. The gas is just one symptom of a caldera escalating across several measurements at once. Through June alone, Italy's geophysical monitoring network recorded close to 400 earthquakes at PPMThe. The strongest reached magnitude 3.6, a genuinely significant event for this particular ARI system. They arrived in 3 separate swarms centered near Agnano, near the Solfatara crater, and near the Astroni and Monte Nuovo zones. Almost all of them were shallow, concentrated within the upper 3 kilometers of crust, exactly the zone where volcanic fluids and gases are actively on the move. The ground itself is rising too. The center of the caldera is currently lifting at roughly 10 millimeters per month. Since January of last year, one monitoring station, IN, the old town of Pozzuoli, has recorded upward movement of more than 80 centimeters within the current phase of unrest, which began back in the mid-2000s. Overall, that same ground has risen by close to 1 2/3 meters, roughly 5.5 feet, above where it sat 2 decades ago. The land beneath Pozzuoli today is measurably higher than it was when the current generation of residents were children. The main fumarole at Solfatara is averaging temperatures around 173 degrees Celsius. Ground temperature monitoring recorded a rise along the corridor directly above the sealed tunnel during the second half of June. Around the same period, a wildfire sent a column of black smoke over Naples, breaking out on the eastern flank of the Solfatara hill, spreading quickly across dry vegetation toward roads running along the southeastern edge of the crater, and damaging or destroying a number of vehicles at nearby dealerships in its path, roughly 2. A dozen people were evacuated from nearby buildings as a precaution, while aircraft ran water drops over the hillside. The official assessment is that this was a vegetation fire, with no current evidence that volcanic heat, OR gas, ignited it directly. That needs to be stated clearly, because it would be easy to imply a connection the evidence doesn't yet support. What is true is that the fire tore through one of the most closely monitored, most gas-saturated stretches of the entire caldera, and that Italy's own thermal cameras in that exact zone had already been logging rising ground temperatures there before the fire even started. The fire made something invisible suddenly visible. For weeks, the danger had been a number buried in a technical report about a gas inside a tunnel. Most residents never set foot in. Then black smoke rose over the city and flames tore through a volcanic monitoring zone. The abstract turned physical. Looking back to the year 1538 puts the current moment into its sharpest possible context. In the late summer and early autumn of that year, after years of ground uplift and swarms of earthquakes strong enough to be felt across Pozzuoli, the caldera opened up near Solfatara, and, over roughly 1 week, threw an entirely new mountain out of ground that had been flat the month before. It was named Monte Nuovo, meaning new mountain, a cinder cone rising about 130 meters that simply hadn't existed 30 days earlier. By the standards of what this caldera is capable of, it was a relatively small eruption. But the activity that came before it, years of uplift, shallow earthquake swarms, gas escaping through the soil, is precisely the category of behavior being recorded by today's monitoring network. Nobody is forecasting a repeat of that event. The official alert level hasn't been raised. But the combination of sustained multimeter uplift, nearly continuous shallow seismicity, elevated fumarole temperatures, and gas venting powerful enough to turn a public tunnel lethal is the closest match the modern instrumental record has produced to the pattern that came before that 1538 eruption. In the early 1970s, and again more sharply in the early 1980s, Pozzuoli went through unrest severe enough that the ground rose more than a meter, and earthquake swarms damaged buildings across the old town. Tens of thousands of people were evacuated both times. The volcano didn't erupt on either occasion. It rose, it shook, it unsettled an entire city, and then it quieted back down. That history is genuinely reassuring. PPMThe has, more than once, produced serious unrest that stopped well short of an eruption. And the current phase could very well follow that same script. But the ground never fully returned to where it started after those earlier episodes. Each crisis left the city measurably higher than before. And the gas now venting into the transit network during this current phase is something the 1980s crisis simply didn't produce. The overall shape of this unrest is familiar. The specific severity of the gas coming out of the ground right now is not. There are 3 things worth watching closely from here. First, the daily flow of carbon dioxide into the tunnel, currently estimated at around 95 tons, with the monitoring report explicitly noting that figure could climb. Further is the single clearest gauge of where this volcanic system is heading. Whether that number rises, holds steady, or starts falling over the coming weeks will tell the real story more directly than almost any other measurement available. Second, how far the gas hazard spreads beyond the tunnel itself, into basements and other enclosed private spaces across the affected zone will determine how far any infrastructure response needs to reach and how many residents are facing real daily exposure risk, regardless of whether an eruption ever happens. Third, the investigation into that hillside fire, whether it's confirmed as an ordinary vegetation blaze that happened to start in an unfortunate location, or whether it turns up any link to the rising ground temperatures already documented in that corridor, will matter for understanding whether surface-level thermal activity is intensifying beyond what the fumarole readings alone are showing. The honest summary of where things stand right now is this. The caldera is in the most sustained, most intense phase of unrest the modern monitoring network has ever recorded. The gas hazard facing people living in the affected zone is real and present right now, independent of whether any eruption ever occurs. Communication between the institutions and the residents living above what they're monitoring has been poor enough that trust has broken down at exactly the moment it's needed most. PPMThe has not behaved like this since the year it last built a mountain. That doesn't mean a mountain is coming. It means the instruments are telling a story that finally deserves the full attention it's starting to receive. This channel will keep watching that tunnel flux number and will tell you the moment anything significant changes. To really appreciate what makes the current situation at PPMThe different from anything in living memory, it helps to understand what this volcanic system actually is and why it behaves so differently from the volcanoes most people picture when they hear the word. Most people imagine a volcano as a mountain, a cone rising above the surrounding land with a crater at the top, and a clear boundary separating the volcanic zone from ordinary ground. PPMThe is close to the opposite of that image in almost every way. It's a caldera, meaning it's the collapsed remnant of a volcanic system so large that its past eruptions emptied out the magma chamber underneath it, and the ground above simply fell inward. What's left isn't a mountain, but a wide, roughly circular basin somewhere between 8 and 12 kilometers across, instead of rising above the surrounding landscape. In many places it sits below it, and in many places it's completely indistinguishable from ordinary ground to a casual observer. A city was built directly inside this basin and on top of it. Pozzuoli sits at the caldera's center. The neighborhoods spreading outward from Pozzuoli into greater Naples cover the caldera's outer edges and the zones immediately surrounding it. Roughly 500,000 people live inside what volcanologists classify as the red zone, the area most directly exposed to whatever hazards an eruption would produce. More than 6 million people live across the wider Naples region, sitting on and around the caldera system as a whole. There's no obvious line marking where the city ends and the volcano begins, because in most places, no such line actually exists in any visible way. The volcano is the ground the city is built on. The two aren't separate things. That's what makes the behavior of PPMThe so consequential compared to almost any other volcanic system in Europe. The question of what happens if this caldera enters a full eruption sequence isn't an abstract geological thought experiment. It's a real question about one of the most densely populated metropolitan regions on the continent and what a coordinated emergency response for millions of people actually looks like in practice. Italy has put considerable resources into building exactly that kind of response framework. The country's civil protection system maintains evacuation plans, designated routes, and receiving areas for the populations in the highest risk zones. Monitoring infrastructure blankets the caldera with an extensive network of seismometers, GPS stations tracking ground movement, gas sensors, and thermal cameras, all feeding data back to the Monitoring Institute in real time. That's the same system that caught the gas building up inside the Flegrei tunnel, on the same network that tracked the rising ground temperatures along the fire corridor, the same instruments logging the shallow earthquake swarms through June. All of it exists precisely because everyone involved understands exactly what's sitting underneath that city. What the current situation has exposed is that sophisticated monitoring and effective public communication are not automatically the same thing. The instruments were working, the data was being collected, but the words handed to the public repeatedly failed to match what those instruments were actually saying. There's a concept worth understanding more fully here, because it ties together every separate signal into one coherent picture. Bradycism, from the Greek for slow earthquake, meaning the gradual rise and fall of the ground surface driven by shifting pressure within the volcanic system below. When fluids and gases from deep underground push up into the shallower crust beneath the caldera, pressure builds and the ground above it rises. When that pressure eases off, the ground settles back down. Ate campi flegrae. This cycle has been playing out across centuries, and the evidence of it is visible in places that required no instruments at all to read. Inside the old Roman market building in Pozzuoli, a structure known as the Macellum that has stood since antiquity, the marble columns still carry the marks of marine-boring shellfish several meters above the current ground level. Those particular shellfish only live and feed in seawater. Their marks on those columns prove that, at some point in the past, the ground beneath that building sank far enough below sea level that water covered the area to a depth where those organisms could colonize the stone. Then the ground rose again, lifting the columns back above the waterline, where they have stayed ever since. That building is a permanent physical record of Bradyseism operating across historical time, readable without a single piece of electronic equipment. The harbor at Pozzuoli shows the same process happening in real time. As the caldera inflates and the ground rises, the seafloor lifts along with it, and the water above it grows shallower. Boats that once moored without any trouble find the bottom rising up toward their hulls. The coastline is physically pulling away from the sea, a centimeter at a time, and fishermen and harbor workers notice it in practical terms long before any official monitoring report gets published. The current uplift phase, which has delivered more than 1.5 meters of ground rise since the modern unrest began in the mid-2000s, represents the most sustained inflation this caldera has shown in the entire instrumental record. Earlier bradyseismic crises in the 1970s and 80s produced rapid uplift over shorter windows before partially reversing. The current phase has moved more slowly, but it hasn't reversed at all. The ground has simply kept rising, adding up year after year, which means the volcanic system beneath the city has been in a state of sustained building pressure for 2 decades straight. Every single measurement in the current data set, the shallow earthquakes, the fumarole temperatures, the gas flow, the ground uplift, all reflect that same ongoing pressurization from below. What researchers are watching most closely now is whether any of these measurements start to accelerate. A volcanic system that has been slowly building pressure for 20 years and then begins showing rapidly rising gas output, quickening ground deformation, or earthquakes clustering at increasingly shallow depths, would be a system approaching some kind of threshold. None of those acceleration signals have been confirmed in the current data. The uplift rate is sustained, but not dramatically speeding up. The earthquake swarms are intense, but they're following patterns the caldera has shown before. The gas building up in the tunnel is alarming in its concentration, but the monitoring report frames it as a serious, ongoing concern rather than a sign of imminent eruption. The honest position is that the system is in an intensifying phase of unrest that deserves serious attention, without yet showing the specific warning signals that would justify raising the official alert level. There's a plan currently being discussed to install powerful ventilation turbines inside the Flegraea tunnel, continuously pulling out the contaminated air so the line can reopen, and that plan captures the exact situation the city now finds itself in. It's a practical engineering fix for an immediate infrastructure problem. It's also, implicitly, an acknowledgement that the source of the problem isn't going anywhere on any timeline a human being controls. A turbine system would keep the tunnel usable for as long as it runs, and for as long as the gas rising up from below doesn't outpace its extraction capacity. But the tunnel doesn't become safe because the turbines are switched on. It becomes manageable while they're running. If the gas flow increases, the turbines need to get stronger. If the gas spreads to new locations, new turbines need to be installed there too. The strategy, at its core, is continuous symptom management, because the underlying cause is a volcanic system whose behavior is set by physics, operating at depths no engineering project can reach. There's something almost clarifying about sitting with that fact directly.